Okay. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, John, for that really kind introduction. And thank all of you so very much for being here today. Anne-Marie and I are really, truly grateful to have the opportunity to share with you why plant-rich diets are such a powerful, yet completely untapped solution to addressing climate change and protecting the environment. And the beauty of the plant-rich diet solution is that we can start today. This is a planetary solution that is entirely in our hands as consumers. It doesn't require political will, new technology, trillions of dollars of investment, intense negotiations, or decades of implementation. All it takes is a conscious decision by those of us who don't face food insecurity, and especially those of us living in wealthier nations, to eat more plants and fewer animals starting today. That's it. And more great news is that plant-rich diets will improve our health and save us money. Research has demonstrated that plant-rich dietary patterns can prevent and sometimes even reverse chronic diseases and are generally less expensive than meat-heavy diets. Now, as you listen to our presentation today and you learn about how the world's high consumption of meat, dairy, eggs, and fish is impacting our planet, please keep in mind that all we have to do to halt and reverse the degradation is to eat fewer of these foods. This one step is extraordinarily powerful, especially if we all do it together. Next slide, please. Now, I invite all of you to fasten your seatbelts because we've got an action-packed agenda for you today. We'll discuss how plant-rich diets can address climate change, protect the terrestrial environment, and revitalize our oceans. We'll share sustainable eating strategies, positive impacts on human health, and we will invite you to join us for our very first global 15-day plant-rich diet challenge starting October 1st. And last, we will leave you with some specific calls to action. Next. Now, before I begin, I'd like to define what we mean by a plant-rich diet. It's any dietary pattern that consists mostly of plant foods, including vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. But optionally, it can also include a small amount of meat, dairy, eggs, and fish. The key is that plants do need to become the new main course. The plate depicted here was published by the Eat Lancet Commission in 2019. This commission brought together 37 scientists from 16 countries to determine the dietary pattern that would be optimal for both human health and environmental sustainability. And this plate here reflects the dietary pattern that accomplishes both of those goals simultaneously. Next. And while some people might think that when you adopt a plant-rich diet, you will eat nothing but boring salad the rest of your life, nothing could be further from the truth. Look at all of these delicious and colorful dishes. Plant-rich eating offers an endless variety of flavors, ingredients, herbs, and spices from around the world and accommodates every cultural taste and preference. And how cool is it to know that you can protect the planet simply by eating delicious food? Okay, now that we're all feeling a little bit hungry, hopefully, let's jump into climate change. Next slide. Since RCAT is particularly focused on the climate crisis, I am going to spend most of my time today exploring the relationship between animal agriculture and climate change. Next slide. On August 9th, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, told us that unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, achieving our climate goals will be beyond reach. While a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius sometime within the next 2 decades is essentially locked in, we do have a short window to avoid locking in a climate catastrophe. The IPCC has made it clear that now is the time to pull out all of the stops and reduce all greenhouse gases every single place we can. And that includes the global food system. Next. And here's why. 2 recently published studies, one of which was spearheaded by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, found that the global food system is responsible for about 34%, or 18 gigatons of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. This is more than double total emissions for the US. 57% of these emissions come from production of animal-based foods, including livestock feed. 29% comes from production of plant-based foods, and 14% comes from other utilizations. The food that is responsible for the most emissions is beef, accounting for 25% of total food system emissions. Now, I see this as an incredible opportunity because plant-rich diets offer us such a simple and fast way to reduce emissions from animal agriculture. Reducing or eliminating beef alone will have a gargantuan impact. Next. To give you a sense for the magnitude of animal agriculture's emissions, here are just a few data points. The top 5 meat and dairy companies combined emit more greenhouse gases than ExxonMobil, Shell, or British Petroleum. Next. In fact, if just cows were their own nation, they would be the world's 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases behind China and the US. Next. This chart helps us to understand why that is. It shows us the greenhouse gas emissions per every 100 grams of protein produced of each of these foods. Producing beef emits about 20 times more greenhouse gases than producing comparable plant-based proteins like beans, other pulses, and peas, which you see at the bottom of the table. Next. Producing other products from cows, including dairy herd beef, cheese, and milk, also results in significantly more greenhouse gases than producing plant-based proteins. Next. Pork and chicken are not off the hook, though, since producing them emits about 3 times more greenhouse gases than producing legumes. Next. To put this data into context, the Natural Resources Defense Council tells us that if every American were to cut out just 1/4 pound of beef per week, the greenhouse gas reduction would be like, next slide, please, taking 10 million cars off the road for 1 year. Next. On a global scale, if the 2 billion of us high consumers of meat and dairy cut our consumption by just 40%, we would avoid 168 gigatons of future greenhouse gas emissions, which is equivalent to almost 3 times total global emissions in 2019. So I'm hoping that you're starting to see how impactful plant-rich diets can be for our climate. Now, you might be wondering where all of these emissions are coming from. So let's take a look. Next slide. The livestock industry is a leading emitter of all 3 of the top greenhouse gases, including methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. Methane comes directly from livestock animals. It's emitted in the burps of ruminants, especially cows, but also sheep, goats, and buffalo. It's also emitted from the decomposition of manure in manure lagoons on industrialized dairies, pig farms, and cattle feedlots. Nitrous oxide comes primarily from growing feed crops. It's emitted from the breakdown of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer used on feed crops and from the decomposition of manure spread on feed crops or left on pasture. Carbon dioxide is released when natural ecosystems like forests and grasslands are converted to pasture for grazing livestock or to crops like soybeans or corn for livestock feed. The carbon that was in the trees, vegetation, and soils gets released into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide also comes from the use of fossil fuels to make fertilizers and pesticides for feed crops and from transporting and processing livestock feed. So let's take a look at each of these gases to really appreciate why a global shift to plant-rich diets can be an absolute game changer for our climate. Next slide. We'll start with methane. The IPCC just told us that fast and drastic cuts to methane are imperative to avoid climate catastrophe. The reason that methane reductions are so important is that methane only lasts about a decade in our atmosphere compared to carbon dioxide, which can last hundreds to thousands of years. But if you look at methane's impact over its short lifespan, methane traps about 85 times more heat than CO2. This is called methane's GWP 20, or global warming potential over 20 years. Now, this is really bad news because methane is largely responsible for the fast pace of planetary warming. In fact, about 30% of global warming to date is due to methane emissions. But methane actually offers us a huge opportunity because if we reduce it now, the atmosphere will respond quickly within a decade or so, and planetary warming will slow down. A lead reviewer of the IPCC report stated that cutting methane is the single biggest and fastest strategy for slowing down warming. Next slide. Well, I've got really good news for you. As this chart shows, 32% of the world's methane comes from livestock. It's the world's second leading source of methane after the fossil fuel industry, which produces 35%. Really, methane emissions from the two industries are almost equal. Remember how I told you that methane comes directly from livestock animals? If we eat fewer animals starting today, the livestock industry will start to downsize. When the animals are gone, the methane is gone. It's that simple. There are other techniques being proposed for reducing methane from livestock that are in early stages of deployment or in development. These techniques will play a role in methane reduction, but scaling these techniques will take time, a lot of money, and some may never scale at all. And the thing is, we do not have the luxury of time. We can't wait. We need to start eliminating methane now. And diet change is an effective way to do exactly that. Slashing methane from both the fossil fuel industry and animal agriculture is imperative. Next slide. Now, how about nitrous oxide? Nitrous oxide is considered a climate super pollutant. It traps 298 times more heat than carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. It's also now the world's leading ozone depleting emission. Well, again, there's good news here. 53% of nitrous oxide emissions come from animal agriculture. And remember that nitrous oxide results from nitrogen fertilizer and manure used on feed crops. If demand for animal products drops, leading to reductions in the number of livestock animals, we won't need to grow as much livestock feed and nitrous oxide emissions will likely drop. Not only is this great news for the climate, it's also great news for our water resources, since we'll have less nitrogen fertilizer and manure and fewer pesticides and herbicides washing off feed crops into our waterways. And we'll touch on this point later. Next slide. Finally, let's take a look at carbon dioxide. Plant-rich diets offer a huge opportunity to cut carbon emissions and facilitate carbon sequestration. So let me explain. Raising animals for food requires an enormous amount of land. In fact, animal agriculture is the largest user of land on the planet, using 83% of the entire world's farmland to graze livestock and grow livestock feed. 34% of global crop production goes to feeding livestock. Next slide. Here's a great infographic from the Plantrition Project. Feeding one person the standard American diet, which is heavy in meat and dairy, requires about 2 football fields worth of land. However, those same 2 football fields can feed 14 people on a mostly plant-based diet. If all 7.8 billion of us on the face of the earth were consuming the standard American diet, we would actually need at least 2 planet Earths to feed all of us. Next slide. This enormous need for land means that the global livestock industry is the #1 driver of tropical deforestation. And when forests or other natural habitats are burned, cleared, and or tilled to create pasture or grow livestock feed, the trees, vegetation, and soils release their vast stores of carbon into the atmosphere, increasing CO2 levels. Not only that, but the ability of the newly cleared land to sequester carbon is severely compromised, which means that more and more CO2 remains in our atmosphere as we clear more land. Next slide. According to a study published in 2020, if the world continues consuming meat as usual, we will pump another 86 gigatons of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere by 2050 from land use change alone. Next slide. However, if the world were to cut meat consumption by 70%, the pasture and feed crop land that we could theoretically liberate back to nature for restoration of native forests and grasslands could actually sequester 332 gigatons of carbon dioxide by the year 2050. That's close to the remaining carbon budget of 360 gigatons that gives us a 66% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This sequestration potential would provide us with a desperately needed time and wiggle room to roll out green energy without exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Importantly, the researchers also found that even if we liberated all of livestock's land back to nature today, we could still produce more than enough protein for every human living on Earth using the remaining cropland. Ceasing fossil fuel is fundamental to limit global warming, but CO2 removal by terrestrial vegetation following plant-rich dietary shifts could substantially contribute to international greenhouse gas reduction targets. Next slide. And just imagine the habitat and ecosystems we could restore. Plant-rich diets offer us an almost dreamlike opportunity to take our degraded planet into our arms and bring it back to life. I hope I've conveyed how plant-rich diets can be a game changer for the planet. Next slide. Project Drawdown, an SRAG partner and a research organization that has evaluated the 76 available solutions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, ranks plant-rich diets as the fourth most powerful solution out of all 76. Plant-rich diets, together with reducing food waste, are the two most powerful demand-side solutions for taking a big bite out of climate change. Now, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time sharing how plant-rich diets offer a plethora of co-benefits to our environment. We'll start with water. Next. Okay, currently, fertilizer, pesticides, and manure runoff from feed crops, together with pollutants from industrialized animal feeding operations and slaughterhouses, are a leading cause of water pollution around the world, causing toxic algae blooms, fish kills, ocean dead zones, and contaminated drinking water. If we reduce our consumption of animal-derived foods, much of this pollution goes away. Next slide. Plant-rich diets would also go a long way to conserving the precious water the world has left. 75% of fresh water globally is used for crops and livestock production. Beef alone accounts for 1/3 of the global water footprint of farm animal production. In the US, cattle feed is our largest user of water, consuming 23% of all water nationally, 32% in the drought-stricken Western US, and 55% in the equally drought-stricken Colorado River Basin. Most of the water used by the livestock industry is for irrigating livestock feed. If people in the US and globally were to reduce consumption of livestock products like beef and dairy, the water currently used to grow animal feed could be conserved or used for more urgent purposes. Next slide. Now, I've alluded to the fact that animal agriculture is the #1 cause of tropical deforestation and destruction of other habitats around the world, and especially in South America. This is taking a heavy toll on wildlife. If we switch to eating more plants and fewer animals, we would very likely curtail deforestation and give these guys a good chance to recover. A global shift in consumer demand is the first and most fundamental step to realizing all of these wonderful planet restoring opportunities I've just described. Next slide. This change will happen even faster, though, if we start providing financial support to farmers to switch from animal agriculture to growing diversified plants like oats, hemp, fava beans, vegetables, etc., and setting aside land for things like carbon sequestration, biodiversity protection, water restoration, etc. Now, this is an area that really needs attention and major financial support right now. At the bottom of this slide are several pioneering organizations, including 3 nonprofits and 2 plant-based food companies, which are already helping farmers to make the switch. I'll just name them: Agriculture Fairness Alliance, the Rancher Advocacy Program, the Transformation Project, Miyoko's Creamery, and HELSA. Next slide. Here is a sampling of brave farmers who are making the switch and blazing a new path for other farmers. Some are doing it on their own, and others are working with the organizations listed on the previous slide. These farmers are shifting from producing chickens and cattle to growing hemp, mushrooms, and organic vegetables, from producing dairy to growing oats for oat milk, and from producing goat milk to making vegan cheese. These farmers are excited about the prospects of a new life that is not only more financially rewarding, but also better for their health and emotional well-being. Now, I've covered how plant-rich diets can powerfully address climate change and have shared a little bit about how they protect our terrestrial environment. Now I'd like to turn the mic over to Anne-Marie, who will talk with us about the impact of our diets on our oceans.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, John, for having us today in this wonderful meeting. Hello, everybody. My name is Ambari, and I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Marina Cities, Singapore, District 3310. Today, I want to talk about our oceans, as the name of my talk suggests, and I will touch upon how our current eating habits and patterns might be a key contributor to what is happening to our oceans. Now, I have constantly felt that the kind of attention that our oceans need has always been underplayed to some extent in comparison to other climate crises. Although beach cleanups are happening at many places, which is great, but what we might want to ask ourselves as environmentally conscious citizens, global citizens, is that if we are cleaning up beaches to save marine life, then is there anything else that we might be doing which could be contributing to large-scale marine decimation? In my talk today, I want to break down why our oceans, which is one of the vastest, oldest, self-standing natural systems of our planet, suddenly needs our help. Before I bring up facts and statistics, I want to take a minute to explain why environmental sustainability, or the chances of survival of life itself on the planet, is a direct and immediate consequence of what happens to our oceans and marine ecosystems in the future. To start with, I want to mention the not so obvious but indispensable services that oceans provide for us, because it is often presumed that the most prominent job of oceans is to provide us with seafood, which is obviously not true. Number one, between 50 to 80% of atmospheric oxygen that we breathe is actually produced by our oceans. The surface layer of the ocean is teeming with photosynthetic plankton. Though they are invisible to the naked eye, they produce more oxygen than the largest redwoods. One other environment regulatory activity that our oceans bear is that they absorb more than 90% of excess heat generated by global heating, because ocean water has a remarkably high heat capacity. But as the oceans become warmer, it is expected that hurricanes and rainfall will also become more powerful. So our marine bodies provide key service of climate regulation like energy budgeting, carbon sequestering, and carbon and nutrient cycling. What I'm highlighting here is that our oceans and the ecosystems that they support are way more important for our survival than just a source of seafood. Now, let's take a look at how the very complex and robust systems that function within the oceans are being disrupted by human interferences. So plastic pollution, mercury pollution, marine ecosystem destruction, etc., are grave issues that are causing threats of immense scale to our oceans. But the biggest and common threat that all of these anthropogenic activities are causing is that all of them are either on purpose or collaterally damaging our vastest ecosystem by killing marine life. Now, we know that we cannot survive without functioning oceans, and our oceans are in great danger, and we want to save them. Let's see what we want to achieve when we step out of our homes to save the oceans and solve these problems. No matter what activity we might be involved in, whether it is to reduce our dependence on plastic, reducing waste, and lessening our consumption of harmful chemicals, or anything else, when we say that we want to save the oceans, it essentially means that we want to save the inhabitants of the oceans. So basically, in order for us to have thriving oceans, we need to make sure that all the species of living beings in the oceans are safe, that the population of each of these species is not higher or lower than what is needed for everyone's natural life cycles to function optimally. Now, let's take a look at that industry, which has the most widespread human activity at the oceans and is directly participating in decimating marine life. You probably can guess that I am coming to the practice of fishing. Now, humans ate fish and other aquatic animals since prehistoric days, and we have much archaeological evidence about that. In fact, one of the reasons why humans would settle near water sources would be because they would be assured of food around there. When fishing primarily happened that way, the traditional way, it never put our oceans in danger because those would literally be a drop in the ocean, meaning oceans have always been too vast as a resource for such small-scale fishing methods to create a dent in them. That way of fishing did not cause issues like overfishing, bycatches, and ghost nets, which are prevalent in the way fish is caught today. They rather gave a livelihood to those who probably were traditional fishermen for generations. So what has changed now? The practice that has complicated the entire process and dynamics today is the modern day industrialized fishing, which functions on a scale that is totally unsustainable, even by the vastest ecosystem that we have on our planet, which is our oceans. This way of fishing is called commercial fishing, which is a multinational, multi-billion-dollar industry that has been depleting fish population and other marine life and the overall marine environment for decades, driving many species towards extinction. So how do we define commercial fishing? As the name suggests, it is just fishing for making commercial profit. When it comes to doing business solely for profit, other elements like competition, cost, and targets, productivity, profitability come into the picture, and the well-being of the oceans takes a comfortable backseat or is totally ignored like it never mattered. Like every business that wants to make economic profit, the commercial fishing industry also focuses mainly on maximizing profitability and minimizing cost, which is fine, but the methods and practices that are employed by the commercial fishing industry cause our oceans to pay a heavy price because they relentlessly try to meet the unsustainable and skyrocketing global demand for seafood. In the course of keeping up with supply for this kind of a demand, the colossal rate and scale at which fishing is being done using factory ships size of football fields is causing an underwater havoc and bringing us close to a marine catastrophe, or in other words, a complete climate breakdown. Today, more than half of the seafood that we consume is wild caught or is a product of commercial fishing. This is a video that shows two of the most popular commercial fishing methods, which are bottom trawling and long line fishing. Let's take a look at how they are employed and the kind of impact they have on the oceans.
When it comes to wild fish, the two main methods of catching fish are bottom trawling and longline fishing. Bottom trawling is a method of fishing that involves dragging heavy weighted nets across the sea floor in an effort to catch fish. It is a popular method in commercial fishing because it can catch large quantities of fish in one go. However, when dragging the large weighted nets across the seafloor, everything that happens to be in the way gets swept up in the nets too, leading to huge amounts of bycatch and also the damaging of the sea floor, which creates harmful algae blooms and oxygen-deficient dead zones. Longline fishing is where fishing vessels trail huge lines of nets through the oceans, with hundreds or even thousands of baited hooks attached along the nets. These nets can be as long as 50 to 100 kilometers. Similar to bottom trawling, the lines are indiscriminate, meaning that bycatch is also a huge issue. With every year around 650,000 whales, dolphins, seals, sea lions and turtles being killed because of the fishing industry, which equals more than 1 every minute. And some estimates said it could be as many as double this number. On top of that, it is estimated that 50 million sharks are unintentionally caught as bycatch each year, which is about half as many as are killed intentionally for their meat and fins. Yet, why is it then that we look in horror at those who eat shark fin soup, when our consumption of fish is also responsible for the mass killing of tens of millions of sharks every single year?
That just said every single year. So, just to give a bit more depth to commercial fishing, bottom trawling and almost all other commercial fishing methods have several severe primary, secondary, and tertiary environmental repercussions, as you saw in the video. The United Nations estimates that up to 95% of global ocean damage is a direct result of bottom trawling, 95%. When a thriving underwater ecosystem is bottom trawled, the ocean floor is left with absolutely nothing but copious signs of violation and damage. The indiscriminate mopping off of the ocean floors by factory-sized trawlers with immensely heavy-weighted nets causes many non-target animals to get caught, in addition to the incredibly high number of fish that get swept off, leading to many of them, like sea turtles, sharks, stingrays, dolphins, sharks, which have important and indispensable ecological roles to play, to be at a threat of extinction. And this problem of bycatches and and thus contributing to marine wildlife plummeting is true for almost all commercial fishing methods. Continuing with the problem of bycatches, according to an article by Worldwide Fund for Nature, in total 38 million tons, I forgot the word million, how can I do that? 38 million tons of sea creatures are unintentionally caught every year. And that is 40% of fish catch worldwide. A large amount of this is either thrown back into the ocean as rubbish, dead, dying, or seriously injured, or disposed of on land. For some species, it is even more. For example, 1 kilo of shrimp, 5 to 20 kilos of bycatch can be found in the nets. Shrimp trawlers discard 60 to 80% of their catch, making their business an extremely environmentally destructive practice. What alarms next is the carbon emissions caused by a previously overlooked source, which is bottom trawling again. Bottom trawling is practiced extensively by dozens of countries around the world, including the United States, China, and the EU. According to groundbreaking calculations done by 26 authors from around the world, it is reported in Nature that bottom trawling is responsible for 1 gigaton of carbon emissions a day, a higher annual total than pre-pandemic aviation emissions. Carbon of this huge quantity is released from the seabed sediment into the water that aggravates ocean acidification as well as adversely affects productivity and biodiversity, the study said. This is because marine sediments are the largest pool of carbon storage in the world. The third point that needs our attention is the compelling issue of abandoned fishing nets and gears called ghost nets that float across oceans. Thousands of kilometers of fishing nets are abandoned or lost in the ocean waters every year by the fishing industry. Again, protected animals like dolphins, sea turtles, and sea lions get entangled and injured by these nets and hooks, and they eventually die of asphyxiation or starvation. A report by World Animal Protection called Ghost Nets Beneath the Waves describes the catastrophic impact of ghost gears on our oceans and mentions that 45% of all the threatened marine mammals have been either killed or harmed by abandoned fishing gear. That's a photo of a sea turtle who was found in this state struggling to set itself free from the fishing nets by an underwater photographer in 2019 around Barcelona. Therefore, picking up plastic materials from the beaches that are visible to us is a good effort to save marine biodiversity, but it might be a myopic approach to solving the overall ocean plastic problem if we fail to address what is happening to the marine animals in the pelagic or open sea areas because of thousands of miles of plastic fishing nets abandoned and lost by the commercial fishing trawlers. Now, coming to the core issue about commercially caught wild fish, which is overfishing. There is often an assumption in our minds that there is plenty of fish in the oceans, which was true till a few decades back. But now there is a rampant problem of overfishing. So what is overfishing? Ocean overfishing is simply the taking of wildlife from the sea at rates too high for fished species to replenish themselves. The facts about worldwide overfishing, which is highly disruptive to the food chain, are surprising and alarming. For example, almost 90% of predatory fish stocks that have been targeted, causing a terrible disruption at the top position of the food chain, and most of the fish that we consume are predatory in nature, like tuna, salmon, etc. Now let's talk about a proposed solution to all the threats that commercial fishing poses on the oceans and see how effective they are for the oceans. Although in theory, farmed seafood and fish or aqua farming are often championed as the sustainable solution to the problem of overfishing and overexploitation of the oceans, the truth is that intensive fish farming has many negative consequences for the environment and coastal communities. Firstly, the way fish is farmed and housed is not hygienic and causes excessive overcrowding in the fish pens. Because of overcrowding, fish often injure themselves, get sick, and fall victim to parasites more easily. To counter these effects, fish farmers rely on antibiotics and pesticides, which obviously contaminate the water. Wastewater is overloaded with food residue, antibiotics, and fecal matter, creating oxygen-depleted zones or dead zones due to algae blooms in the natural environment around the farm sites. Secondly, due to large releases of nitrogen and phosphorus and fecal matter into the waters, this kind of intensive farming has been seen to damage the coastal environment by causing eutrophication and acidification of water. Globally, up until 1970s and 80s, it was not very obvious that dissolved oxygen would become critical in brackish and shallow coastal systems. It was much later when large areas of low dissolved oxygen started to appear with associated mass mortalities of invertebrates and fish. Thirdly, coastal ecosystems are often completely destroyed in order to make room for intensive aquaculture. This is the case with the artificial ponds created to farm tropical shrimp. Mangroves are chopped down, leading to the disappearance of all the species that take shelter in the trees, including oysters, birds, and more. This also implicates the removal of a strong and natural barrier against storms, tsunamis, and other climate disasters. Another example of why aquaculture might not be an effective environmental solution to the problem of fish is the problem of fish feed, which remains a thorn for the aquaculture industry. Known in the industry as forage fish, species lower down in the food chain, such as sardines and anchovies and crustaceans like krill, are turned into fish meal and fed to farmed fish, which contributes to unstable fish populations. Billions of small wild fish need to be caught to feed all the farmed predator fish, giving rise to an aggressive cycle of excessive fishing. According to proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, it takes 5 pounds of ocean fish to produce just 1 pound of farmed salmon. So here also you see a tremendous inefficiency in calorie conversion. Such a high demand for fish meal is leading to overexploitation of the small forage fish, a staple of the local diet traditionally caught by artisanal fishermen and smoked and dried by women. The decline in fish stocks is causing food insecurity, job losses in the local artisanal sector, as well as environmental damage and public health hazards in the areas where fish meal plants are installed due to contamination generated. Therefore, the impact of aquaculture on wild fish stocks remains largely contentious at the moment, given the finite nature of global marine resources. The sector's overdependence on fish meal and trash fish for feed opens it to several ecological risks. In fact, being the leading farmed fish producer in the world, the development of China's aquaculture sector offers striking evidence that aquaculture in its current form has not only failed to restore fish stocks domestically, but also emerged as a contributor to diminishing wild fish stocks worldwide. So when the environmentally conscious consumer, like you and I, were unhappy with the severe environmental implications caused by commercial fishing industry and aquaculture industry, a new solution was brought in to encourage us to continue buying seafood labeled as sustainable seafood. What is sustainable seafood? Seafood that comes in packaging claiming its contents as certified sustainable is sustainable seafood. It means that the fish were declared as sustainably caught by either an organization, private company, or government agency. Basically, sustainable seafood means that the fishery claims to be making efforts to kill fish in a manner and rate that did not cause overfishing, help to rebuild depleted stocks, minimize bycatch and interactions with protected species, and conserve essential fish habitats. But requirements to get a sustainable seafood certification from the varying entities differ. Popular sustainable seafood labels have different standards for fisheries to qualify to use its label on packaging, which can be confusing to the consumer. You can check out their websites for more information on how they evaluate fisheries. Whatever the measures may be, it is important to remember, like I mentioned before, like every other industry, the fishing industry exists primarily for economic reasons and not to protect the future of the oceans. If protecting the oceans was a top priority to these companies, then they would do more than simply alter their fishing practices to be just a little bit more sustainable. Their will to protect the oceans would be clearly visible in their actions, where they would stop using these commercial fishing methods altogether. So the question to ponder over is whether we as consumers are being lured to pay more to buy sustainable seafood only as a feel-good factor with no real and convincing environmental accountability. In conclusion about the oceans, I would like to just simplify my presentation and bring the salient points that I just spoke about. Firstly, we need to understand the obvious. That is, to save the planet, we have to save our oceans. Captain Paul Watson, who is a marine conservationist, once said, "If the oceans die, we all die." So the oceans and their inhabitants are amongst our greatest allies in the fight against climate change. Therefore, let us come together to protect the oceans and not exhaust it like a bottomless resource of unbelievable amounts of fish and seafood being pulled out at ridiculous states and scales. Secondly, we need to understand that saving our oceans essentially means taking action to restore the marine biodiversity to ensure least disruption in the way marine plants and animals function in tandem with one another. Third, the first step towards solving a problem is to identify and acknowledge the problem. Undoubtedly, industrialized human activity that is most widespread in open and coastal seas is commercial fishing. Attempting to save the oceans without addressing the threats that commercial fishing and aquafarming pose on them is like ignoring the elephant in the room. After having identified this problem, one of the most powerful and effective solutions that we can be a part of would be to consciously be aware of how much fish and seafood we consume, because the price of our food is not just the money that we pay to buy it. There is a huge environmental price that is hidden from us that our oceans bear for our seafood and fish consumption. As of now, none of the solutions that are being offered to us by the fishing industry are sustainably foolproof. There are many gray areas that need much testing and implementation before coming up with convincing results. Therefore, to make a conscious decision to collectively reduce our consumption of fish and seafood is something that can actually hit the nail on the head in the long run. Coincidentally, because of the malpractices happening in the waters, fish and seafood are increasingly becoming less safe for human consumption. Today, marine animals are living and breeding in toxic and unnatural environments loaded with plastic, heavy metals, and chemicals, which when we consume become a part of our systems. And with overexposure to them, there are major risks of various health implications that we could face, like Vibrio and foodborne infections, as well as sepsis. So if the facts and statistics that Andrea and I presented here is making you feel that you might want to modify your diet, but are not really sure how to start the journey, then here are a set of very easy and small steps that you can take, which can be very promising for the future of the planet. For example, you could go meatless once a week or multiple days a week. Just make one meal a day 100% plant-based if that's possible. Swap out cow's milk for a non-dairy milk like soy or oat in your coffee, or simply eat a plant-rich or a plant-based meal whenever you can. Another very interesting way would be to eat a plant-rich meal at your club or district meetings, which will not only help you reduce your carbon footprint, but it might also inspire other members to get educated about the hidden environmental cost of our daily diets. To encapsulate a solution to everything that Andrea and I just spoke about, what we want to propose is that every meal every meal time can be a time for us to fight the climate crisis and substantially reduce our carbon footprints. Every time we sit down to eat can be an opportunity for us to help in freeing up precious natural resources in significant numbers, as you can see here. If not a plant-based meal, then even if it is a plant-rich meal with more plants in it and less animal products, even then, consistent small consumption changes can potentially give us large environmental benefits. Something to note here is that modifying our consumption patterns, which is a demand-side solution, would not require any technological innovations. It totally depends on what we choose to eat. Other important and long-term changes like modifying our electrical grids to use cleaner forms of energies would need years of research, programming, testing, and implementations. Whereas eating a plant-rich meal or a plant-based meal whenever possible can be done immediately and can give us the necessary time to look for solutions to other problems. Of course, there is no denying that growing food, whether it is plants or animals, both hurt the environment, but the difference between the two is evident. So yes, growing plants have some impact too, but only a minuscule fraction compared to breeding livestock. Now I'm going to just turn the mic over to Andrea to cover the health benefits.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Okay, I'll just quickly conclude here with a few thoughts. One of the greatest things about plant-rich diets as a solution to the climate and environmental emergencies is that they're simultaneously one of the most effective ways to improve human health and address the global chronic disease epidemic. Next slide. Research in nutritional science. Next slide, please. Anne-Marie?
Yeah.
Oh, next slide. Okay. Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah. Research in nutritional science has demonstrated that diets rich in whole plant foods reduce our risk for chronic disease like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and even cancer. And plant-rich diets can also improve our health by lowering blood sugar, cholesterol, blood pressure, and reducing inflammation. Next slide, please. A recent study published in June of this year, I don't know if we have a delay. Next slide, please.
Can you see now? Is this the next slide?
Oh, I'm not seeing it, but maybe it's on my end.
No, it could be mine too.
Okay, well, I'll just let you know. A recent study published in June of this year found that plant-rich diets also help to protect against COVID-19. The study found that people who ate a high-quality plant-rich diet were around 10% less likely to develop COVID-19 than those who had a low-quality diet, and they were 40% less likely to become severely ill if they developed COVID-19. Next study, or next slide, please. And a report, I'm just going to go ahead because we have a little bit of a delay. A report published in 2020 by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, and other INGOs analyzed the potential impact on health if the world were to adopt any of 4 plant-rich dietary patterns, including flexitarian, pescatarian, vegetarian, or vegan. And they concluded that compared to what would happen if global diets remain unchanged, a global shift to plant-rich diets would significantly reduce mortality, preventing 12.7 to 13.7 million premature adult deaths in 2030. They also projected that a shift to plant-rich diets would reduce diet-related health expenditures, meaning direct and indirect costs from coronary heart disease, stroke, cancer, and type 2 diabetes, by an average of 95% worldwide in 2030. And the authors suggested that the savings in healthcare costs could be invested in lowering the cost of nutritious food. So next slide, please, Anne-Marie. So with all of that said, we now would like to invite all of you to register for our upcoming global 15-day plant-rich diet challenge starting October 1st. It's going to be a ton of fun. And you can register using the QR code or the registration link shown here. And Anne-Marie is going to put the link in the chat box. And thank you, Anne-Marie. During the challenge, you're going to receive a starter kit and a daily email with a new plant-rich recipe to enjoy and interesting facts about our diet's impact on the planet and human health. And you're also going to have access to an absolutely fantastic lineup of expert speakers. You'll hear from scientists, climate and sustainability experts, medical practitioners, an Everest mountaineer, entrepreneurs, a pioneer in rural community empowerment, and some plant-rich cooking enthusiasts. The speakers are going to discuss a range of topics from protecting the planet to preventing and reversing chronic disease to showing the power of plant-rich lifestyles to invigorate our lives and our taste buds. Next slide. So in conclusion, we have 4 calls to action, which are that first, we invite you to consider experimenting with a plant-rich diet yourself. Second, please sign up for our 15-day global challenge. Third, consider promoting the challenge in your clubs and district. And fourth, suggest plant-rich meals at your club meetings. So on behalf of Anne-Marie, the Plant-Rich Diet Task Force, and myself, I want to thank all of you for your time, and thank all of you as well for all of the amazing work every one of you is doing to protect and restore our planet. Thank you.